This week, we're going to turn our attention to common tropes of the school story. We talked about this a bit during week 1, but of course now we have a lot more material to consider. Let's begin by remembering that the Magnet and Tom Brown are very different beasts. First, Tom Brown is a mid-Victorian text. It's a novel that someone would have bought from a bookseller, and it would be a reasonably expensive acquisition. It wouldn't have been read by working-class boys, partly because those boys wouldn't have had the money or the time to read a fat novel, and partly because education and working conditions for those boys often took them out of school and put them into the workforce by the time they were 10 or 12. Thomas Hughes wrote the book to give his son an idea of what to expect when he went off to school. It became popular because the public school, to us a private boarding school, was establishing itself as a central pillar in the English ruling class's hold on domestic and imperial position. That meant that going to boarding school had become commonplace for boys of Tom Brown's class, and also that schools were becoming more like one another as they all felt the same imperative to prepare their students for lives as rulers in the overseas British Empire, and for some, as local authorities. By contrast, The Magnet is a much later publication. It started in 1908 as a weekly paper that boys could buy for a halfpenny from local newsagents all over England, part of a mass of cheap and readily available papers for children and adults that came into being starting in the late Victorian era. The Magnet was cheap enough that boys bought their own copies without needing to talk an adult into buying it for them. That also meant that the content could be more directly appealing to boys, since the editors could assume that parents mostly wouldn't be reading it. At the turn of the century, papers featured a mix of serialized stories, in which a short piece would be printed each week, and longer complete stories that a reader could consume whole. By the time of the Magnet stories you are reading, publishers had realized that readers wanted complete stories, but that serials kept them returning to buy the paper, and so the compromise you were reading came into being. Each story is complete, but there is also a serialized element in that the stories each week connect to one another. By the late 1920s, when your Magnet story begins, detective stories were somewhat supplanting school stories for boys, and so Charles Hamilton threads the needle by having a mystery set at a school and requiring schoolboys to be detectives. I'm sure you've noticed that humor in the Magnet is rather broad. In the very first story, for instance, all the comedy revolves around Bunter's lying and being punished for it. You might also have suspected that Charles Hamilton is being paid by the word. He was. You can see this in the slow way the story plays out, the amount of repetition, even the attention to detail in describing beatings. Each blow receives its own yaroo. Beatings, of course, are a common trope of school stories. In Tom Brown, boys misbehave in various ways and then are flogged for it. In The Magnet, beatings often take on a central narrative role, channeling the narrative energy of the story toward a climax that coincides with corporal punishment. Like the other common tropes of school stories, physical punishment was commonplace at schools at the time, and this punishment was often harsher than anything you will find in schools today, absent a severely abusive situation. For example, in Stalky & Company, the boys are beaten by the headmaster and retire to the bathroom to wash off the blood, so we know the punishment is very severe. Another common trope of school stories is scenes of feasting. Now, eating scenes are typical of children's books. You might think back to Alice in Wonderland, for example, which uses eating as a plot mechanism for growing and shrinking, as well as featuring in other portions of the text. But in school stories, eating is a time of pleasure and sociality. These scenes don't typically take place in the formal dining halls where all the boys gather for school-provided food. Rather, the kinds of eating we see in school stories is tuck, bought with pocket money from a tuck shop, a feature of every school, and consumed in studies with a few good friends. In the case of Bunter, we also have another way of thinking about food, since he routinely steals it. Pleasure in eating is supposed to be a hallmark of schoolboys. Bunter takes too much pleasure, and his immoderation warns boy readers to be circumspect in their consumption of food. Schoolwork features in all school stories, and it has some interesting implications. Remember that Tom Brown's father didn't send him to school to be a scholar, but to become a gentleman. Well, school stories usually present formal lessons as something to be endured rather than enjoyed. They show boys using cribs, translations passed from boy to boy in an age when formal schooling meant an unchanging progression through Latin texts, and express understanding or remorse that boys would resort to such a thing. In all school stories, it's important to be good enough at school, but never to be too good. Remember in Tom Brown when we learned that the prefect system had broken down because too many smart boys had risen to the top of the school? What that's about is the system of promotion in English schools, which was based on one's mastery of the subject rather than age or maturity. So if you got all the way through the Caesar, you could move on to Virgil, and if you mastered all the Latin texts and were ready for Greek, you would be in the sixth form and be at the top of the school, the class just about to depart for university, and the one from which school leaders were drawn. In this system, a clever boy who cared about his studies could reach the sixth form at 14 or 15 years old and be given authority over boys who were 3 or 4 years older and substantially bigger. Being clever was bad, but being a hard worker, a swot, was worse. Of course, being as lazy as Bunter was bad, but you also wouldn't want to show that you had to work very hard in school, as that would be tantamount to admitting you were not very smart or cared more about school than about being a gentleman. You will notice more common tropes of the school story as you read The Magnet this semester. Think about how they are different in The Magnet than in the school stories sold as 1 or 2 volume novels. Because The Magnet was produced quickly and cheaply, the tropes are repeated more in those stories and with less variation, so they will be easier to see. Your forum post this week will give you the opportunity to locate and analyze more of these tropes.